Hi, I'm Barb.
Hi, I'm Pat.
Pat and I have a lot of interesting conversations.
Yes, and we thought you might like to listen in to our podcast that we've called Coffee House Inspirations.
We hope you will enjoy our topics.
Good morning, Barb.
Morning, Pat.
How are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm great. I'm looking out my window here into the green spaces beyond. And I have to tell you that we were driving out in the country yesterday, and sometimes we look at the colors and we say, is that green or is that greener than green?
I know, right?
We just had this beautiful rain and everything is just popping out, and it's
Well,
gorgeous.
yeah, I find that when the green first starts coming out, that it does seem greener than green, and then it seems to fade a little bit. But when it first comes out, when all the green starts showing, I have found that it's like this dark emerald green, and then it kind of fades as the summer goes on. But I think you're right. I think it is like just a vibrant,
Yeah, it's just
green.
It's awesome. It's awe-inspiring. Is the way
yeah.
Anyway, so today we decided that we were going to talk about generations and how generations are defined and what generation we might know people in and how they get defined. And so I thought, if it's okay with you, I would just start with a little bit of history on this whole business of defining generations.
Okay.
So a lot of the hard data comes from the States, unfortunately. So I was kind of moving in between some of that data from the US and also from Stats Canada, really. And so it was interesting that the very first generation to get named was done by the Census Bureau.
Oh, okay.
But consequently is the only generation of baby boomers, the first generation to be named, is the one and only time that the government had any influence in defining a generation. So that was the one and only. Everything else beyond that is kind of a loose kind of definition. So the idea of social generations was introduced in the 19th century. And social generations are cohorts, a common demographic of people who were born in the same date range, share similar cultural experiences, and have been shaped by significant events or social trends while coming of age. So the cohorts on the generations, are really defined over a period of about 20 years. And that's a loose thing because it's not a scientific definition as much as it's a useful identifier sort of. So there were two researchers, William Strauss and Neil Howe, influential authors in the American generations, define a social generation as the aggregate of all people born over a span of roughly 20 years, or about the length of one phase of life. So that's kind of your informative years, when you're childhood, young adulthood, and then of course definitions into midlife and old age, because we're still studying the bejesus out of boomers anyway. So
the Jesus out of what?
Boomers.
Oh, right.
Because we're fascinated with boomers because I think partially because, well, we're boomers and
we're so complex.
We're so complex. That made me laugh. It's so complex, but we also define it was a very strong definition of a generation because it was post World War II. And there was a kind of a low birth rate in the countries that were affected by the Second World War. But anyway, let me backtrack a little bit because I wanted to explain how they identify the age cohorts, because they talk about this Strauss and Neil Howe. They decide about three criteria, which seems to be about the way most generations are defined loosely. And that's their age, location in history, that members of a generation encounter key historical events and social trends while occupying the same phase of life. So it would be a cohort of people who all experienced, post Second World War life, who all may have a group that may have experienced, after 9/11, because that affected probably Americans more deeply, but generation in that, because I can remember, Kristen calling me from she was on her way to school, and somebody had the radio on, and they talked about the Twin Towers, and both of us remember exactly where we were, exactly what the conversation was, and exactly how the front part of that day went. Defining characteristics. So beliefs and behaviors is the second criteria. Members of a generation are shaped by lasting ways, by how the eras encounter the eras, as children and young adults, and they share common beliefs and behaviors. And the third criteria is the perception of membership. That's members of a generation are aware of the experiences and traits that they share with their peers. They share a common perceived membership in that generation. And I think that goes for kind of across the board. So that takes us right to the boomers, us complex boomers.
That's us.
So that's following the Second World War. And the economists, businesses, and policymakers began labeling generations as a new way to measure and study demographics. So it was really all about understanding demographics. And baby boomers, those born between 1946 and 1964, were the first generation to adopt a widely accepted label. And that was a pretty large span of time, depending on when you were born in that generation, right? Because if you were born right after the war, your experience might have been a little different than if you were born in the late 50s and early 60s, because the times were changing and there were different cultural influences. And I think that will probably bear out for each group. The generations before the baby boomers were named retroactively, like they didn't study them necessarily, they just said there was a silent generation or something like that. So the baby boomers achieved their generational label due to the spike in birth rates following the war and a clear date to end that spike with the introduction of birth control. So lots of babies after the war. I think the population kind of doubled. And then at some point in time, women or families started saying, hey, wait a minute here, slow down. And it changed the trajectory, because there was a very low population post-war. So this was kind of had some way of I guess balancing the society in a way. Do you think? Yeah. And so the Census Bureau first referred to the years between 1946 and 64 as the post-war baby boom. As the people born in this boom started to age, and agencies began using the term baby boomers to help them target the demographic. And this was the first and last time a generation's official name had its origin in any government agency. Okay. So, what do we know about baby boomers? Well, what do we know about baby boomers? We should know. We should know. I mean, my sisters were quite a bit older than I am. And so their experience of the baby boom was very different than mine, because it was very early post-war, and people were kind of reestablishing economies and reestablishing families and communities and all that sort of thing. And by the time I came along, we were already into almost the second phase of boomers, which was the 60s, the flower children, the hippies, the pre and post feminist era. So there were a lot of different aspects of that baby boomer generation. Yeah. It's hard to define it exactly as such. Well, I read that some researchers actually wanted to subdivide the generations into two 10-year periods, because
because they were so different. Like if you were at the very beginning of the baby boomers as opposed to the very end, like that's quite a bit of difference. Like usually the generations are about 15 years, right? 15 to 20 in there.
Yeah.
And they can be your experience can be pretty different. And then also if you're at the end or at the beginning of a generation, they call that like a cusper, being a cusper.
Yes, and I
And
think
so you've got kind of some traits of both generations.
yes, and that's a very good point, because I think in all these generational definitions, you find that there are different influences, like you say, at the beginning of that era definition and towards the end of the era definition. Even with our own children who are millennials,
Yeah.
they're now starting to call them older millennials and younger millennials rather, because they're already seeing the difference between the ones that were born at the beginning of that era, which is what
Mhm.
and the children that were born towards the end of that era. So I think you're right. I think it's a really loose kind of definition to explain some overall trends.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so on to finishing off with the baby boomers here. The baby boom lasts 20 years in Canada. During the time, I went to look for Canadian stats because they were kind of hard to find, because we've been looking at all of this organization called PEW.
Right, that's right.
Which is a kind of a large research center in the US that studies all sorts of things. And during that time, more than 8.2 million babies were born.
Wow.
An average of close to 412,000 a year. In comparison, the number of births in 2008, when the population was twice as large as during the baby boom, was only 377,000 children were born in 1 month. So it was about 100,000 less. So that really had a huge impact on the population of the Western world, really. And I'm European. It's really kind of hard to. I found that it was hard to look much past the Western world, because then you have to dip into a whole different data pool.
That's right.
Because there were different influences in different countries, obviously. So I think it's fair to say we're really looking at the Western world, aren't we?
I would say so, yeah.
So the first just finish. I want to get out of this baby boomer stuff already, because partly this was the biggest bulge to date in historically in the growth of the countries. And so of course there's a whole economy around the boomers, right? What are the boomers doing when they're in their 20s? What are the boomers doing when they're in their 30s? What are they doing when they're in their 60s? And so that the economy kind of shifts according to the needs of a generation, especially when you're looking to monetize. Like, how do you make money off of these generations, which is just part of how the economy goes. But from that point of view alone, there's always a shift required, because if you're looking through a span of 20 years and people are aging, and now boomers are moving into that bulge of the kind of the aging population, and what is required there, it's a whole different thing than when the boomers were in their 40s. So especially from a cost factor.
Yeah.
So so they said by 1965, people were marrying at a later age and were waiting longer to have children, because they had options, like birth control and all that sort of stuff. Partly because women were entering the workforce as well, because that's when women really started entering the workforce. And partly because there was general access to better methods of birth control, of course, which was
yeah.
However, so in spite of the changing economy and changing attitudes and expectations towards lifestyle and longer life expectancy are redefining this generation's approach to aging and retirement. So it also changed the perception of what a lot of what aging meant and could mean. People are living longer, wanting higher quality of life, better healthcare, I guess you could say, better healthcare decisions. And so that generation is also living a little longer. So I always say to my kids, keep paying your taxes. Yeah. We're gonna need it. And so on and so on. So, you know, so then it had a, even though boomers were defined in that 20-year span, you look at the longevity of that generation and what happens as time goes on too, because it also redefines some things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So then we bumped over then into the next generation, which was Generation X.
Generation X, yes.
Okay.
So yeah, Generation X also can be referred to like the latchkey generation, latchkey kids, and they're about, you already mentioned a couple things, like they're considered between about 1965 and 1980, loosely, like again, it's loosely could be mid 1960s to mid 1980s, but basically they're saying from about 1965 to about 1980.
Yeah, that's
is
the
Gen X.
Yeah, because it
Yeah.
varies, you know, because it's such a loose definition. I also saw it from 66 to 74. So it really depends, because it was not statistically sound.
That's right. That's right. So so I have a child who was born in 1980. So he would be what they call a cusper. So he would be at the latter part of the Gen X, beginning of the millennials. So they fall between the boomers and the millennials. And most members of the Gen X generation are kids of the silent generation and early boomers. They're also often the parents of millennials and Generation Z. And so, like I said before, they were often called the latchkey generation because, like you said, a lot of the moms were going out to work at that time, and a lot of the kids were left to come home to an empty house between, you know, after school till the time that their parents got home, and you know, they were left alone at that time. And it was a result, yeah. So, and there was also a larger divorce rate at that time too. So there was increased divorce rates, and let's see, they were also called the MTV generation, because that's around the time that the music videos started coming on TV.
The very beginning of it.
The very beginning of it, yeah. You know, they'd be walking around with their boom boxes on their shoulders and stuff.
I remember that.
That's them. But yeah, so so they were called at one point, they were characterized as slackers and being cynical.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that changed as they got older. Like I think the Gen X's were the main heroes of the 9/11, I believe. Because they were old enough then. They were, you know, they were the firefighters, they were the policemen, they were, you know, they were the people that kind of responded mostly to 9/11, like that age group.
Yeah. Wow, that's interesting. I was looking at, because the Gen X were kind of, you're right, they were kind of in that area where there was a lot of societal changes, right? I mean, society was shifting so much because the economy was shifting so much, and then, they were more, I think, more affected by social changes, because you're right, there was, for whatever reason, increase in separation and divorce, and that female labor force participating more. So that would be, you know, leave children a little bit less parented.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was the start of a technology change.
Yeah, that's when the computers first started coming into the home. Not the internet yet, but computers started coming in. Video games, you know, stuff like that were starting up. There was like Commodore. There was, what were they? Commodore, Atari. Those kinds of. Remember those?
Yeah.
And also the music started to change. You got that's when the hip hop, punk rock, and eventually grunge, like a lot of the Generation X were the grunge musicians themselves.
No,
So all of that was changing as well, like the music and.
And that would have been a big change too, because that's where, you know, it's interesting because we were talking about this the other day when we were first kind of conceiving this idea of how people looked at some of those new generational things as like, oh my God, what's happening to the world?
Exactly.
And yet as an evolutionary process, it led people to yet another level of musical expression, of individuality, of opening a world to define their own generation in some ways, because we all had that experience. None of us wanted to be defined by our parents' generation, because it's like the worst thing in the world. And yet it was always kind of considered a bit of a treasonous thing to move too far out of the generational norms.
Well, it makes perfect sense that I mean, that there are generations and that they're going to change. I mean, they have to.
Yes.
Times change, the world changes, political changes, music changes, everything changes. So that generation has to change with it.
For sure. And to lead it, and because these are also, you know, a generation of intelligent, creative people. So they're taking the resources of their generation and making it their world.
Yeah.
And in ways that I find quite interesting. So what else can we say about Gen X?
Let's see. Okay, that was also around the time, you know, that they had there was that big crack epidemic, and also the beginning of the AIDS epidemic too.
Oh, right, of course.
It was in that time period. Yeah. So, you know, and if we're all old enough to remember what was going on there, you know, then. And as they got older, they kind of got a little bit more respect as far as, you know, being called the slackers, and because they actually started, as they got into the workforce, they actually did pretty well. There was a lot of entrepreneurs, and you know, they got into, I think it was the beginning of the .com era.
Yes.
And so they actually did pretty good.
Well, they laid the basis for the new generation, which was the millennials.
That's right. Yeah.
And so the millennials could start at that point, because I think each generation starts at the point where the others have kind of gone on their way.
Exactly.
So are we ready for the millennials?
Yes. Yeah.
The millennials,
go for the millennials.
Millennials will knock your socks off. Millennials is now overtaking the boomers in the number of people in that generation. Partly because the boomers are moving to the great beyond, as my friend Karen says. But because there's no kind of birth rate in the boomers anymore, so they're eventually going to go on their way. So the millennials are kind of taking over for that bulge in population. And they're that age between sort of their current age is between 25 and 40. So that was, the birth years between 1981 and 1994 and 96. So that's also a pretty large range. And I did come across an article in the Huffington Post. Was it their Huffington Post or the New York Times? I can't remember. From this guy who was a millennial born early in the range, and was talking about, hey, don't bump us off into the whole millennial population, because we're really different than the young millennials.
That's true.
And so yeah, I thought that was interesting to note as well. So there's the generation size. Now keep in mind, this is US, so this will be very different for Canada, but it's 72 million. So there are other names where they were going to originally be called Gen Y or Gen Me. Some people thought they were a little narcissistic. Gen We. And they were also called the Echo Boomers, and nobody liked that because nobody wanted to have boomers in that scene. So they
didn't want to be associated with the old folks.
Yeah, because the millennial really is because of the millennial change.
Right.
So they say that they consume 95% still watch TV, but Netflix edges out traditional cable as a preferred provider. Because they're always looking at this from what are the millennials doing so we can make some money off them, sort of thing. Cord cutting in favor of service streaming is the popular choice, and I think that's so true. So there's so many things that are different with, I can only use my kids and their friends as an example, but very few people, I shouldn't say nobody, very people have cable TV. Nobody has a landline telephone, and nobody gets the newspaper, because everything is kind of online, and they're very current, very up to date, but they don't read newspapers for the most of the part. Extremely comfortable with mobile devices, but 32% will still use a computer for purchases. They typically have multiple social media accounts, because social is a big deal. And then they looked at their banking habits, which I thought was really funny, because that hadn't really occurred to me as a thing, Millennials have less brand loyalty than previous generations. They prefer to shop product and feature first, and have little patience for inefficient and poor service, which I can attest to. The millennials place their trust in brands with superior product history, such as Apple and Google. They seek digital tools to help manage their debt and see their banks as transactional as opposed to relational. They don't have a relationship with their banks. They use it as a transaction place.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, we had a conversation with our millennial daughter this weekend, who had to call a bank for some or a credit card company or bank for changing some information, and their customer service was bad, and that's the end of them.
They're out.
They're out.
Gone.
and so that was kind of interesting. So I was looking.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, for sure.
Do your millennials, like we've both got millennial kids. Yeah. Now, one of mine does not like talking on the phone. See, I actually thought that's what you were going to say. Do you find that with your millennial kids? I mean, they would much rather send a text, an email, something like that. She does not feel comfortable talking on the phone, or she doesn't like it. Do you find that with yours at all?
Well, I think that everything is so relative. Like the pandemic has changed communication quite a bit too. So you have to kind of almost factor that out, I guess, and look at pre-pandemic.
Right.
Well, and I think that from my experience, my daughter is more inclined to talk on the phone than my son is.
Okay.
Well, he'll like a shorter conversation to the point, and follow up later, sort of thing, and so I think that might be maybe related.
Just a personal thing.
I don't know, but
okay.
I would say for sure a lot of ease with the internet, with texting, with online, online communication.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so I think some of those things are very individual, and what I'm noticing in these definitions is that it's kind of general.
It is, yeah, you're right.
It's like there are some things that apply to some people and and I think that's the point that this young man was making when he wrote the article. He said we were also people.
Mm-hmm.
That although you can generalize some of the things around the sort of demographic of this age group, that you have to always factor in that they're individuals.
Yeah, and I think that's actually why some of those research wanted to subdivide them.
Yeah.
Is because because they're so different from the beginning to the end of a generation.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
So then there was a little note in here that said what's on the horizon for the millennials. Millennials are powering the workforce, but with huge amounts of student debt. This is, and I don't know whether that applies to Canadian millennials as much as American, but I don't know that. I would have to check into that. This is delaying major purchases like weddings and homes because of their financial instability. But also remember that the U.S. had that big recession too, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And we were a little bit buffered by that because we hadn't had banks in Canada don't have quite as much control as the banks in the US do. Millennials choose access over ownership, it says, and which can be seen through their preference for on-demand services. They want partners that will help guide them to their next big purchase. I'm not sure what that means, but somebody's going to tell you what you're going to buy. I don't know what that means exactly. So it was interesting because a lot of people have been writing about the millennials because they're this bulge, this population bulge, and employers have also been looking at the characteristics of the generation too, because they're so, there's such a big influence on the workplace, and how to streamline jobs for millennials. What do they think is important, and how does that affect the workplace? Because there's this idea that they're not as committed to this grind, and like balance, family or home and work balance more, and are more inclined to look at the maybe the ethical outcomes in a company, and how does that relate to their workplace and job sort of thing. Really interesting. I find it a really interesting demographic because in the part of it is numbers too, but part of it is social awareness. I mean, the millennials, they just flooded in this pandemic. They flooded the vaccination times, and they're being vaccinated in huge numbers. And so that, I think, has a couple of implications for how this pandemic goes. And they're powerful. They're very powerful.
Good for them.
Yeah.
I was surprised that their range ended as early as it did. For some reason, I thought their demographic went further,
No.
like past the year 2000 a ways. I was actually surprised. Like, I thought we were just coming out of that millennials.
Yeah.
But we aren't. But anyways,
they're 1980, about 1981 to 1996. But they were approaching the millennial, which is how they got that
right.
As you could say. And they're, it'll be interesting to watch, because they came into the world with already such a comfort level, for example, with technology. The leaps and bounds in that generation have been mind-boggling, because they were already comfortable with technology and took it for granted, and just it's like, okay, you left off here, well, we're not going to go back and look at that, we're just going to take off from where they know where that is, and it boggles the mind that what has happened in that short generation from a
yeah.
So then, because we know our alphabets, because millennials were Gen Y, so we're gonna move on to Gen Z.
Yeah. Oh, where are they? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So after the millennials comes Gen Z. So this is what I was surprised at. I thought, for some reason, that we were either still in the millennials or just coming out. So I was surprised that there was this Gen Z. So the Generation Z, also one of the names they've been called are Zoomers. So they succeed the millennials,
which I gather they don't like very much.
Which they don't like, and they are precede. So I guess the next generation is going to be Generation Alpha.
Yes.
After the Gen Z. So so they're mid to late 1990s. So they'll take after they'll go after the millennials. So about 1997, 98 to the early. It says the early 2010s. So I think they're just about coming to the end of their so-called generation.
Yeah. So
there's Generation Z.
I did read a couple of stats that were different, and I don't know, because they all change from wherever you're looking at them. But they did say 1997 to 2012 / 2015. So they're now, they say 6 to about 24.
Yeah, because it does say the early 2010, so that would be about 12, 13, 14 in there. Yeah. So as the first social generation, to have grown up with access to the internet and portable digital technology from a young age. Generation Z have been dubbed digital natives, even though they're not necessarily digitally literate. So they were also called, they were called many other things. Let's see, they were called the I generation, you know, for the iPhone.
Yeah.
Gen Tech, Gen We, you know, WII for the We, Homeland Generation, Net Gen, Plurals, Internet Generation, Centennials, and Post Millennials. So, you know, I found it interesting that the way that they got their name is they kind of saw, the researchers and so kind of saw what stuck. And all of these names were kind of floating out there. And then it seems like whatever sticks and people start using, that's what they get tagged with. That's what I found anyways.
Yeah, I think you're right, because it's nothing more, really nothing more scientific than that.
Yeah,
And
that's right.
I think it was the same for millennials. They reacted to post boomer or whatever it was. And, you know, they're just, you play around with these names for a while. And, you know, even in that Generation X, you know, there was really no name for them in the beginning. And there was a Canadian author by the name of, I think it was Donald Copeland or Douglas.
That's right. Yeah.
Who actually wrote a novel about that post boomer generation. And that's where really that definition came from. It wasn't anything even really scientific. So okay,
Yeah.
sorry, side trip there, but go ahead.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think you're right about that. And plus, they mentioned Billy Idol also had a band named that for a little while there, that Generation X, and I think that played into it a little bit there too.
Yes.
But for that generation, for naming them.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So you're right. They just kind of float around and whatever sticks. So they're still kind of looking at this generation because, you know, they're not really, they haven't really come into their own yet. And so they're still kind of in that area where they're kind of watching, researching. They were the first generation to be born into, like you said, with the millennials, how when they were born, they, with the technology, they kind of knew it, but they were kind of rebounding off of Generation X. Generation Z came into it all. Yeah. They were just born into it already being there, like all of those things from the different generations, previous generations.
Yeah, I read a statistic where I can't remember where I read this, where they received their first mobile phones at around the age of 10.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, because many of them were, and I think we've all seen this, you know, where I've seen restaurants where parents have got their kids, you know, young parents have got their kids with the iPad, and they could be 4 or 5 years old, and they're just managing the whole thing like it was nothing.
Yeah.
And you want to walk over and you want to go, hey, show me how you just did that. You know?
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. But and because of that, now they are also looking at the negative effects of the amount of screen time that these kids are on, because the negative effects of the screen time are more pronounced on the adolescents compared to the younger children. They also have higher rates. I found this interesting, higher rates of allergies and mental health issues.
I didn't see that anywhere. That's interesting. I wonder what that's about.
And earlier, and the girls are going through puberty earlier.
Food.
I think I agree. It's in the food. It's the additives and stuff, right?
There are so many hormones in foods. I'm going to start sounding like one of those grumpy old boomers, but you know, there is a move, of course, in the industry to eat better, to be aware of the foods that you're consuming and that sort of thing. But by and large, the large chemical companies and the large, you know, multi-million-dollar farming operations are still using hormones all the time, chemicals all the time. And that affects the cells in the body. It affects the whole hormone system is so predominant, but more noticeable in girls than boys and women.
Yeah.
I do think that still has something to do with it. And I think that Gen Z, because they're so they're so tuned into the environment for the most part.
Yeah,
And I mean, that's the, you know, Greta Thunberg generation there
that's right.
is on the move.
Yeah,
And they are with the millennials a large enough influence in the population to make some huge changes.
yeah, yeah. They're also the most the millennials were pretty good at this too, but they're also the most diverse. And they're really into the gender roles and stuff like that, and they're a very diverse generation. The
Yeah.
millennials were probably, I think, the beginning of that.
Yes, I think you're right, because I've read that in a number. This is why I have so much hope for the, you know, for the future is based
Exactly.
on when you're born into a multicultural environment like the Gen Z, that doesn't seem like anything unusual to you. And even millennials
Exactly.
were born into that, you know, into that era, and that at the beginning of that cusp and of the kind of the increase in immigration and movement and that sort of thing, and the generation or the gender identity issues, all of those things that are second nature to the newer generations, because they're coming into it with an acceptance that doesn't even, you don't even wonder what's the problem here.
That's right.
So when you take that, when you take that kind of along with awareness of the, you know, of the entire kind of mess we've made of the environment.
Yeah.
And the racism and the lack of tolerance, and you hope that that is where this movement will be.
Mm-hmm.
That there is always going to be forces, I'm sorry to say, that will speak otherwise. But if the majority of the population is looking in those directions and accepting changes like that, I think we might be in some pretty decent shape to survive.
Yeah, it gives you hope.
I know it does.
I mean, look at all the all the young people that came out for all the demonstrations last summer and stuff. I mean, you had multiracial people, you know, kids coming out and stuff like that. And I just want to say, you know what, they're on track to be the best educated generation yet.
Yeah, I read that as well. That was very encouraging as well. Well, you know, it was interesting to watch. You know, do you remember when Greta Thunberg came over to the U.S. and in Canada? And this is a Gen Z who had traveled on a boat essentially from Europe to the U.S. And when you looked at the numbers of young people that were influenced by her initiatives,
mm-hmm.
her sense of urgency, and you stack that up to the kind of the present political structure and how afraid people are to lose their current resources, even though they could be killing us.
Yeah.
And you want to say, okay, let's move a little faster in the generational development before it's too late. Because the message was, and the message is, this is not a plan for next year. This is right now. And I think people are getting that message and understanding it. And I mean, who's more, I mean, in my experience, who's more, you know, committed to recycling and to renewable resources and to saving the environment than millennials and Gen Z?
Exactly. And I think that's why I say it gives me hope, and it gives hope. I think hope for the future, that a lot of these older generational, some of these, I don't know how to say this, but they're kind of stuck. They're kind of stuck in some old ways that need to be, that they need to be gone. Let's just put it that way. They need to be gone. And I think these new generations coming up, the millennials and the Gen Zs, I mean, they're coming up, and I think they're going to make some really good changes, and they're going to shake things up pretty soon. And we're going to shake the bad apples out of the trees.
I think that's true. And I think that they have a sort of a civic sense to them as well. And a global perspective that maybe we didn't have, and access to the information that they have. Yeah, it's very hopeful. So we should probably, we're getting a little short of time here, so we could probably on a positive note, and then look forward to what this Gen Alpha is going to come up with.
I know, right?
because I was doing a little research on that, and it says, this researcher by the name of Mark McCringle, he coined the term Generation Alpha to identify the group after Gen Z. He said the emerging generations these days sound like a bit of alphabet soup. Just over a decade ago, I was researching my first books, The ABC of XYZ, understanding the global generations. It became apparent that a new generation was about to commence and there was no name for it. So I conducted a survey to find out what people think of the generation after Z should be called, and that's where they came up with the Alpha. So there's something else to look forward to.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, well, thanks.
They can pass the torch on to them.
Yes, that's right. Bye, boomers. Well, I have to say that I think each generation has brought something extremely unique to the table, and that when there's less resistance and more of an open mind to look at what is positive and what is doable and what is good change, then we stand a chance for sure.
Yeah, because I think every generation has their time. They've got their moment in the sun, and then it's time to pass it on to the next generation, because they're the ones that are gonna carry it through. And we need, the older generations need to support and encourage the newer generations coming up.
Exactly. Well, that's a good note to leave on. So for one moment, have you watched anything good lately?
I have. Isn't it your turn? Because I haven't.
Well, I've been watching movies, which I don't watch a lot of movies on Netflix. I'm gonna date myself here. Maybe I'm in my heart, I'm a millennial or something. I've watched a couple of really good movies on Netflix, but because I'm not prepared, I can't remember the names of them because I'm a boomer. But I will post them.
Okay, well, I will recommend something. I don't know if anybody, if probably everybody's is probably already set for this tonight. If you're a Friends fan, are you a fan? Because they're having that reunion tonight on TV.
Oh, right.
Were you a fan of the Friends show? Yeah.
When was it? I was a little generation early on that one.
Okay. Well, I was a fan. My daughter's a huge fan. I'm sure she could win a trivia contest. But anyways, that's on tonight for a couple hours, and that looks pretty good. So I bet you they get a really good viewing audience.
Awesome. Okay. Well, thank you for that. And we'll see you next week.
Okay, Pat. Well, it was a good talk, and you have a great day.
You have a great day too, Barb. Bye.
Okay. Bye, Pat.